Hello, friends. How's it going? It's Michael Parker, and welcome back. In the 2022 film Nope, directed by Jordan Peele, a giant UFO that haunts a Southern California community is discovered to be a predatory, cloud-like alien creature that consumes living beings and resembles a jellyfish. When I saw this film in the theater upon release, the first person I thought of is our guest today. Scott Deschaine, he's my friend. He's a filmmaker, a researcher. He is a bookmaker. He has 3 films, including Not Alone, The Life Above, The Cohoke Light, and his latest offering, Dracula. His website and YouTube channel are called The Living Sky, and Scott's idea is that our atmosphere may provide habitats for a variety of living creatures that we sometimes think are UFOs. Scott, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to see you again. Thank you for having me on your show.
It's great to see you again. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll talk about later in the show at some point. I spent some time with Scott in Marfa, Texas back in 2013 looking at these things called Earthlights. But before we get to that, one sentence that you had that always speaks to me and I think provides a jump-off point for the premise of this show is you say that we live at the bottom of an ocean of air. Explain.
It's interesting. Once you start thinking of our Earth as a unified system, you realize that there's not a hard line between land and water and atmosphere. And one of the things that we take for granted is that our atmosphere surrounds us. It provides the whole environment in which we live. But it really is a fluid environment, and it's massive. I did some calculations, and we think of how massive the oceans are. And our atmosphere has 5 million times more volume than all the Earth's oceans. So it's really kind of just adjusting our perspective a little bit to think there's not a hard line between the oceans and the atmosphere. And there's massive amounts of gas and fluid and material moving through the atmosphere. So why would there not be some of the creatures that we see moving through the oceans moving through the atmosphere? And this is kind of the basis for the whole living sky hypothesis, is that many so-called UFOs seem to resemble creatures that move through the Earth's oceans. And some of the most successful creatures in the oceans are the marine invertebrates, specifically jellyfish and squid. And we see a lot of parallels between these creatures and what people report as UFOs. So this is a hypothesis that's been around for a while. It was first proposed by the author Charles Fort.
Yes.
In 1923, in his book, New Lands, and he had a great saying. He said, "It seems no more incredible that up in the seemingly unoccupied sky there should be hosts of living things than that the seeming blank of the ocean should swarm with life." So when you stand at the edge of the ocean and you look at it, you don't see all the creatures that are moving through it. But now we know that there's an immense variety and number of creatures moving through the oceans. And I propose that if we just start looking at the atmosphere, we're going to find that same variety and number of creatures moving through the atmosphere. We already see them. We've seen them where there's a lot of historic evidence. And I think if we direct our efforts there, we're going to find a whole new realm of light.
When I met you, Scott, this was the first time I heard the idea that you're going to explain in this episode. But so you mentioned Charles Fort, and there was also Ivan Sanderson. And what was his take on this?
He believed that a lot of UFOs acted like living creatures. Now, one of the things that was kind of a challenge is where do we fit these creatures? And some of the earlier people that looked at the hypothesis, they proposed that they were some kind of energy beings or some kind of creatures from another dimension. But to me, that unnecessarily complicates the issue because they really do resemble marine invertebrates. And so it's not really a stretch. It's not beyond our known biology. It's just slightly expanding our frontier of what we consider life on Earth. Now, I don't know if you're aware of, or if your listeners are aware that Kenneth Arnold, the fellow that saw the flying saucers, and actually because of his sighting, they coined the term flying saucers.
Yes.
After 20-some years of studying them, he concluded that they were natural phenomena. They were creatures like fireflies moving through the atmosphere. He said they pulsed and they were a natural phenomenon. Some of the first astronauts, like John Glenn and Scott Carpenter, when they first went up into space, they thought, and Carpenter himself said, they thought that they were critters, living critters up there in the atmosphere. When Glenn described his fireflies, they sound like bioluminescent plankton or bioluminescent animals that were moving past the capsule. I know some of the NASA scientists wanted to say, oh, that they were just ice crystals, but Glenn was clear in his first description as he was there that they were all over the atmosphere, and they weren't coming from the capsule. So it's interesting because they did a 50-year commemorative, like a video about the Friendship 7 mission, and Glenn and Carpenter was still talking about the fireflies 50 years later. They weren't convinced that it was just something coming from the capsule. They were still convinced. And I'm curious why there hasn't been, and this to me is one of the most important things I want to discuss and share with your listeners. I'm curious why there hasn't been this acceptance of the idea that our atmosphere could be alive with life. To me, that's a puzzle.
Well, it makes me think of things like panspermia. And when we talk about astronauts and the STS footage and these things where these anomalous beings of light or whatever these things were exist, well, the first thing I think that scientists are probably resistant to is the idea that, well, first of all, there's no oxygen. So how could they be up there? But if the idea of panspermia is legitimate, and I think that it is, then it speaks to the fact that some organisms would be able to travel maybe in some type of state that doesn't look like life yet is, through an inhospitable environment.
I think you have really hit upon an important point here, Michael, and that is why I think this is really important to study. In my research on this topic, I've talked to scientists in different disciplines, and it's one of the challenges that science is kind of cloistered. There's all these specialties, but I don't think there's a lot of interaction, necessarily enough interaction. One of the gentlemen I talked with was a freshwater jellyfish expert. And he told me that there's a part of the jellyfish's life cycle where they enter what's called the podocyst stage. And it's a dormant stage. It's an indestructible cyst. And they tried irradiating it, freezing it, burning it, and freezing it for years. And they take it and put it in water and poof, it comes back to life. So that form would be ideally suited for going across the vast reaches of space, basically immortal until it reaches a friendly habitat like Earth's atmosphere. And we actually see this sometimes, that when comets pass by the Earth, sometimes there are UFO flaps as if something that was in the tail of the comet actually drifted into the Earth's atmosphere and caused a bloom of these invertebrates moving into, springing to life once they hit the water vapor of Earth's atmosphere. That to me is one of the important reasons to study this, because it could lead to us exploring a mechanism for reaching out to other worlds.
I was looking through some of your material, and you were talking about the podocyst and this very complex circle of life that a jellyfish has. And at one point, because maybe you could tell the audience, there's several different points in the circle of which a jellyfish exists. And at one point, they can even reproduce asexually.
Yes, they reproduce sexually and asexually. They're amazing creatures. And it's interesting. Some people who study UFOs are stuck with the idea that they are mechanical, that they are some kind of technology. And some people seem a little disappointed at the possibility that they might be living creatures. But to me, these creatures are just absolutely amazing. They are true survivors. They're indestructible. Some of them are almost immortal in some ways, because at some point in their life cycle, they can even regress. When conditions are unfavorable, they can regress to a previous form in their life cycle. So they reproduce sexually and they drop millions of eggs. Then they produce a form where they're like a polyp, and they start reproducing asexually. They start budding off little tiny polyps, which move through the water. And then when they reach a certain point, I think they're triggered by iodine for some reason. When they trigger to that point, they mature to what the familiar Medusa form that we think of as jellyfish. Jellyfish are bioluminescent, so they have incredible light-producing capabilities. They're very agile. They're really wonderful flyers through a fluid environment. They have stinging cells that they use to trap prey, to stun prey. And these are all similar to the kinds of things that we see with UFOs. Some people are puzzled by the fact that UFOs seem to change shape. And one almost universal thing is that they seem to pulse. So this is very similar to the appearance, the movement, the bioluminescence, the effects on people. These are all very similar. They're very parallel to what we see with marine invertebrates.
Let's return to the idea of of this ocean of air. You talk about the volume of water that can be transported in the air and the various gases that make up the mix of what we call air. Talk a little bit about that and how that could sustain a creature that maybe uses that as its habitat.
Well, I don't have all the answers.
You got
I
a
mean,
few.
this is what's one of the things that's challenging about this topic is that you have to know a little bit about marine invertebrates, you have to know a little bit about the atmosphere, and then you have to know a little bit about UFOs. So to find that kind of overlap is what I'm hoping that we can encourage in the future. The atmosphere is huge, it's vast, and it's largely unexplored. There are vast regions of the atmosphere that we have no idea what's going on. I think there's a lot of UFO activity that's been seen around the edges of storms where we see clouds with a lot of their energy and a lot of their water vapor. And this is another theme that we see throughout any kind of biology, throughout any kind of wildlife study, is that life seems to congregate around the edges of habitats where you have the resources available from one habitat and for the other habitat. So the wildlife can move back and forth. And we see that in the sky. So if you use the analogy of the atmosphere as an ocean of air, we think, what's at the bottom of the ocean? If we think of coral reefs in the liquid oceans as like good habitats because they offer shelter and they offer food, we see the same kind of activity around the crevices, the habitat edges on the surface of the earth. We see a lot of what you call earth light or mystery light activity around crevices, around springs, around earthquake faults. This is where we see a lot of mystery lights. And the question is, well, are these just some kind of chemical or physical phenomena, or are they some kind of bioluminescent creatures that we haven't fully explored, we haven't even begun to explore?
I'm glad you brought that up because when I start thinking about what you have to offer, and in the last 10 years, especially post 2017 in the New York Times article, there's been a lot of talk about the tic tac and craft seen above water and below water. And then I think of this one of the five observables, and UFO geeks know what I'm talking about. And one of the five observables is trans-medium travel. Objects that have the ability to travel easily in various environments and conditions, seemingly without any change in performance capabilities. And that, I think, speaks to some of what you're talking about.
Now, we know, and we've talked about jellyfish. Let's also talk about squid because those are the two
Yes.
major groups that we see. The jellyfish seem to resemble the disc-shaped objects, and the squid seem to resemble, or I should say the cigar or rocket-shaped objects seem to resemble squid. The squid that we know of actually leave the water and travel through the air for up to a mile. In fact, there are some that are called flying luminous squid. There's actually a species of squid called the flying luminous squid. So it's a matter of just pushing the boundaries a little further. Well, could some of the giant things that we see actually be some kind of marine invertebrate moving around? But
Scott, the first time in an interview back in like 2014 or something, you told me that squid could travel for a mile in the air. I literally, I was slack jawed. I had never heard that. So explain how a squid would do that and leave the water and then travel through the atmosphere.
well, squid are like living jets. They have a mantle which squeezes the water and acts like a siphon. It actually squeezes the water. Plus, they have the ability to chemically alter their buoyancy so they can move up and down in a column of water. And I would assume at some point, if they're leaving the water, they can actually control their buoyancy in the atmosphere. They also are bioluminescent. They have incredible bioluminescent capabilities. And they also have the ability to camouflage themselves. They can change their colors. So, for example, they can change one side of their body to blend in from below. If you're looking up in the water, the bottom of their body will blend in with the sky. And if you're looking at them from above, you see the top of their body will blend in with the dark water below. And plus, they're amazing hunters. They are apex predators, and they employ chemical warfare, chemical weapons to hunt.
Neurotoxins?
Yeah, they can actually spray out neurotoxins and anesthetic gases or anesthetic fluids to stun their prey. So when you start following this train of thought, you go, where does this go? Where does this take you? And if you consider that there's creatures moving through the sky and some of them could be apex predators, you think, well, if that's the case, wouldn't we see some evidence of predation from these creatures. I'm sure you're familiar with the work of David Paulides.
Yes. Missing
And
411.
right, some of this, the missing 411, and he talks about how they are regularly in areas where people don't go that often. There's regularly evidence of predation or missing people. In fact, in one report in California, he described these campers, these hunters, that had seen a glowing squid-like object moving through the trees right before there was a disappearance of someone there. So the idea that there's wildlife moving through the atmosphere and that we're sometimes the prey is a little bit disturbing, but it's something that's definitely worth exploring.
I'm a bit familiar with his general ideas, and what I think in many of these cases, they do happen in proximity with water.
Yes, and that is one thing. And the idea that you mentioned about the transmedium movement is, it seems it's not just water and air, but it's also in the earth and air. The brown mountain lights are a well-known mystery light. And there was a study there in the 1960s where some local gentlemen erected a tower to see if they could watch the lights. And they saw the lights, these floating orbs, pulsing orbs, actually emerge from the ground. And they like kind of swam up through the atmosphere to where the guys were in the observation tower. The observers started to feel weak, and a couple of them passed out. So that's some more evidence there of some kind of predation or some kind of toxicity of these creatures. But they saw them actually emerging from crevices in the ground. So this is another thing. We see them near springs. I've just begun exploring the idea of these creatures' relationship to sulfur. That's a whole nother topic we can go down if you want, but
Yeah, I think I do want to visit that. Let's return just for a second because I just
Okay.
want to make sure people understand what we're getting at. So in this movie, Nope, which have you seen this movie, Scott?
I have not seen it yet.
Well, I'd be willing to bet that Jordan Peele had read or seen your work because in this film, what he's talking about is people think this is a UFO. And I'm sorry, this is a spoiler, but the film's been out for 2 years, guys. And it's actually this giant jellyfish-like creature that can camouflage itself amongst the clouds. It looks like a disc, maybe like a UFO from below, but it's actually a jellyfish. So what we're talking about here is the possibility that there are undiscovered animals within our atmosphere similar to jellyfish. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. And it's interesting because once you start down this path, it's adjusting your scale. 50 years ago, people would not have believed that billions of microorganisms inside of each one of us control our health, our attitude, our very ability to digest food and exist. Now, so we expand that scale. Okay, people now accept, oh, yeah, there are things smaller that we can see that affect our lives. Well, wouldn't it be sensible then that there may be things bigger than we can perceive that might affect our lives? We're living in a historic time. You mentioned the space shuttle footage, the fact that these astronauts were up there observing for long periods of time objects in the atmosphere. And there's some historic footage there of objects moving around that seem to be living creatures. They move, they act like creatures. So that is one historic body of scientific evidence. It's unimpeachable, the source and the fact that it's there. It's public domain. You can see this stuff.
That was
And
the tether incident, correct?
That was just one. Yeah, the tether incident is one of the most notable incidents, and that is STS-75. The astronauts were conducting an experiment where they were going to deploy a 12-mile-long tether into the atmosphere. And the idea was that the tether was going to drag through the atmosphere to generate a static charge. And they were going to look at the idea of using this kind of technology to power space probes. And the force of the tether, they deployed it from the shuttle. The force was too great. The tether snapped and broke free of the space shuttle. So they circled around the Earth watching the tether. They orbited the Earth. And as they came around, the tether came into dawn, and they were still in night, and they were looking at dawn, and they saw the tether, and it was swarmed by hundreds, looks like maybe even thousands of pulsing disc-like objects that came and they surrounded the tether. If you look at the Living Sky, I provided an uncut version, the best version of that I could find of this incident. And it really is truly I use this term too often, but it is a mind blower. If you look at this with an open mind and you say, what am I seeing here? You realize that this is something that nobody's ever seen before, and it changes everything. So that is one historic piece of evidence. There's also an amazing piece of evidence from STS-80, where the shuttle is passing by and these lighted objects move by the shuttle and they form a circle, like a giant circle in the atmosphere. And then one comes right by the shuttle and goes right into the middle of the circle and goes boom and lights up. So it's like the aliens came calling and nobody answered. I don't know how to explain that, but that again I think it's a truly historic moment in science.
The question about this NASA footage, the few times I've even tried to address it, they explain that it's ice crystals or it's some kind of particulate matter that's then catching light, I guess, and being seen on our cameras as something else. But really, the fact that they've addressed it with such little attention actually calls more attention to it. But time goes on. People forget about these things, and it's good that your film exists to catalog this, because a lot of people have never heard of this stuff. Nerds like us have, but a lot of people don't know these things exist, and it speaks to this idea. So why is it not more investigated, and why do you think that is?
I think there's a certain stigma attached to the topic of UFOs, and
Right.
I don't want to get conspiratorial, but I wonder if that is somehow by design. I think when it was first became evident, and we have to think of a historical perspective, during World War II is when it really became common to have fleets of airplanes moving through the sky. And that is when people started to see objects moving through the sky. And then first pilots that actually describe some of their UFO encounters seem to describe what they called living things, they even called them monsters or something that seemed to be playing with them. And so the whole idea that there are creatures or things moving up there that we have no control over, it would seem to me in the best interest of public safety and mental health to just discount the idea. Unfortunately, that attitude persisted in an age where I think we might be mentally and culturally ready to accept the idea that we might not be the apex species on the planet. There may be layers and layers of species above us that don't even care what we're doing, that are just carrying on their own business. But it's interesting. I put up the actual dialogue from the John Glenn Friendship 7, the first time a man orbited the Earth. And I got a scathing response from a former NASA engineer.
Which one?
Like, James Oberg.
Yes.
So he was like, this UFO garbage, pushing this UFO garbage. And I said, wait a minute. I said, look, I'm not saying these are aliens. I'm saying these could be living creatures moving through the atmosphere. So we went back and forth a few times, and he said, well, you know what? This is intelligent and well-reasoned. So I was like, woof. I was impressed that James Oberg didn't blow me off. I think it's a huge area for potential further study. The most appealing thing about this hypothesis is that it lends itself to further study.
I want to follow up on something, because a lot of people will say, and I know that you've addressed this in other shows, but this is going to be new to a lot of people. They're going to say, well, Scott, Michael, if these animals exist or organisms exist in our atmosphere, where are their carcasses upon death? Explain your take on that.
That is another great question, Michael. And like I said, when you start chasing down this train of thought, you say, well, if there are creatures moving through the atmosphere, wouldn't we see their remains? And there have regularly been reports of blobs of jelly actually falling from the sky. There's a famous report in the 1950s of these Philadelphia policemen saw a glowing blob drift to the ground, and they came upon it, and it was, I think, 6 feet across, and it was still pulsing and glowing when they arrived there. And they called some of their other colleagues to come see it. And by the time their other colleagues came there, it had basically sublimated. It had gone from jelly to just vapor. It had dried up. And we see this kind of stuff. In fact, there's a name for it. I think the Welsh term is called puertercer, which means star rot, where blobs of jelly fall from the sky. And if people do encounter these, they should not touch them. I know there was a case in Oregon. Was it Oregon or Washington State? Where a lady named Sunny Barcliffe, there were blobs of jelly falling from the sky. They were getting on the windshield. And when people touched them, they felt some kind of stinging sensation. So if these things are from some kind of invertebrate. People should be careful to not touch any kind of stuff that falls from the sky. But so people do see what maybe remains. You see some strange footage of weird clouds drifting to the surface. But you have to think, too, in terms of the ocean. At the surface of the Earth, the pressure in the atmosphere is much greater than the pressure higher up in the atmosphere. So if an organism that's made mostly of gas and water vapor and diffuse organic material starts sinking down in the atmosphere, it's going to be crushed by the increased pressure as it gets closer to the surface. So it's not a regular thing, but people have seen often, they've seen blobs of jelly, blobs of things falling from the sky.
Well, tell people what jellyfish are primarily made up of.
They are primarily made up of the medium in which they live, which is in the water. They're made up mostly of water vapor. So we have seen cases of objects that look like jellyfish emerging from the water and moving up into the sky. And I wonder if at some point when they leave the water, it's almost like a metamorphosis, and they expunge some of the liquid water and then absorb the gas as they move up into the atmosphere. I know there were some reports around Catalina Island of these emergences of disc-like objects, swarms of them coming up out of the ocean into the atmosphere.
Yeah, the idea of USOs has certainly gained more prominence in the last 20 years, and the Catalina Island incidents, there's quite a few of them. This is all fascinating to me. One thing you talk about, and you touched on it for a moment, is this idea if you see a UFO, whether it's one of these types of organisms or an extraterrestrial craft or man-made craft, is stay away from it. Why?
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, if these things are like marine invertebrates, they have a variety of hunting mechanisms, which include stinging cells. Jellyfish actually have nematocysts, which are stinging cells that send out barbs with toxins that paralyze and numb their prey. And again, as I was following down this thread, I've read that people had adverse effects from their encounters with UFOs. And I said, well, okay, I wonder if anybody's ever done a study of this. And there was a fellow, John Schuessler, who did an analysis of the effects of UFOs on humans. And I said, well, okay, let me go see what the effects of marine invertebrate stings are on humans. And they overlaid the two, and it was almost an exact matchup. And a lot of people who have had so-called close encounters with UFOs have actually had short-term and long-term debilitating effects, including like paralysis, mental impairment, skin irritation. Some people describe it as being hit by a bolt of lightning, which is common when people are stung by some of the more powerful jellyfish. There was an analysis in a journal called Medical Times of a forester in New Jersey who was driving through the forest near Wanacue Reservoir, which was the site of some major UFO sightings. And a disc-shaped object came over his truck and repeatedly stalled his truck and kept hunting him as he was trying to get away. It would repeatedly stall his truck, and this thing would stop on the top of his truck. And he went to the hospital a couple of days later because he was feeling weak and he was feeling fatigued, and he never recovered. So if someone does encounter or see one of these objects, I would suggest getting to cover, because a jellyfish the main body might be in one position, but its tentacles can stretch down much further than its main part of its body. Mm-hmm. And this is the case for many UFO observers, where they may see a UFO way up in the sky, but some of them actually will feel like a tingling or a burning down below. So I would suggest avoiding, if you see something like that, getting to cover, avoiding it. And if you do encounter it, get to the hospital.
You've told an incredible story in the past, and there was a family, and I believe this was in the 1970s. They were driving from Perth in Australia, and they were driving on this stretch of road, and some kind of creature or thing basically attacks them in their car.
Yes, that's fascinating, because this will actually lead into what I mentioned earlier about sulfur. It was the Knowles family traveling across the Mundrabilla Plain in southern Australia. And they had seen this lighted object in the distance, and the object approached their car and smacked into their car. And then it came back and it actually landed on top of their car and lifted the car off the ground. the mother reached outside the window and felt a spongy thing on top of their car. And they smelled what they described as the odor of decomposing flesh. And if you think about a jellyfish, its mouth and its anus are the same orifice. And so if this creature had some kind of previous prey in its gut, that might have been the decomposing flesh that they were smelling. But one thing that puzzled me about the story was that they described their voices as sounding very strange and distorted. And I mentioned this to a colleague, and he said, "Oh, sulfur hexafluoride." And I said, "What?" And so I don't know if you're familiar with sulfur hexafluoride, but it's a gas. If you inhale it, it has the opposite effect of helium. It makes your voice sound like Darth Vader. And if you go on YouTube, you can see professors demonstrating it. So I thought, wow, sulfur hexafluoride, what could that be? And so I looked up what the naturally occurring sources of sulfur hexafluoride are, and they are mineral springs. So I said, well, are there any mineral springs in Australia where these lights occur? And I don't know if you're familiar with the Min lights. Have you heard of them?
I'm not sure.
That's another mystery light. And it's amazing how many of them there are around the planet.
Yes.
But they are in Boulia, Australia. There's been a couple documentaries produced about them. Some of the people familiar with them say that they seem to have a population of lights, whatever they are, but the population they are around in Boulia. There are mineral sulfur springs there. Now, the interesting thing about sulfur hexafluoride is that it short circuits electrical circuits. So if we think of the behavior of UFOs and their effects on vehicles,
The scene in Close Encounters.
exactly. And this is common, like that forester I described, where his truck kept stalling. It kept stalling. And pilots have reported that all the electronics on their craft go out. So if these things are using sulfur hexafluoride, whether consciously or indirectly, that could help explain why they have these effects on our electronics.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty fun stuff, isn't it?
Super weird. So you have another horrifying story that I want to let our audience in on.
I'm full of them. Horrifying stories.
And this one happened in the South Indian Ocean. Now, you had written an article for 40 Times, I believe back in 2012 or 2013, and it's on your website as well, or at least the cover. But I believe the story originally came from that because I read it many years ago, and it was a story of a steamship or something in the Indian Ocean and a giant jellyfish. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, this is one of the things that we find hard to believe. As vertebrates, our size is limited to our skeleton.
Right.
But invertebrates, they are not limited in size. So jellyfish can grow basically unlimited to a certain extent. But there have been reports of giant jellyfish in the Indian Ocean. And there was one, I think the steamer was called the Coranda. And they were in a storm, and the front of the ship went below the waters. And when it came up, it had been fouled by a giant jellyfish. A giant jellyfish had covered the deck of the ship, and it was threatening to sink the ship. And this thing was so huge, they could not get it off the ship. And a couple guys were lashed by the jellyfish. They were stung. One man died, and they had to call in another ship who hosed it down with hot water to get it off of the ship. That also in the ocean, there have been reports of giant wheels of light, these big miles wide rays of light that move in radial patterns. And you think, well, what kind of phenomena is that? And maybe is it something moving across the ocean, or is it some giant diffuse organism that we just can't perceive because it's bigger than what we normally think of or can even perceive with our limited vision? So it's interesting stuff. In fact, and we mentioned Catalina Island, there was an episode of UFO hunters where they were investigating the Catalina Island incident, and they're out on a ship, and they go, oh, there's an anomaly there in the ocean. And it's a giant freaking top of a bell of a giant jellyfish. And they're looking right at it, and they don't realize that they're looking at the top. They called it an anomaly, but yeah, it looks like the top of a giant jellyfish, but it's bigger than what we can imagine. And this kind of leads to the other big historical discovery about 30 years ago of the existence of sprites in our atmosphere. This is another thing that we only recently have discovered, and it's a huge field for further study. And pilots had reported seeing flashes objects above the tops of big thunderstorms. But the University of Alaska at Fairbanks first recorded them. And now we know that these things look just like jellyfish. They look and act like bioluminescent jellyfish. And they can be up to 100 miles tall. And that's mind-boggling when you think of an object in the atmosphere above our heads, just moving around doing its business up there without us even being able to perceive it.
We think a blue whale is big, but if sprites turned out to be living organisms, that would by far be the most gigantic set of creatures on the planet.
It's kind of amazing. And then you realize that there's no end to that scale, that we're perceiving them, but beyond that, there's something even bigger. I know there was footage from a shuttle flight flying over the coast of Florida, and you can see the entire state of Florida below. And there's this a storm. I don't know how else to describe it. It's this giant mass of what looks like water vapor or something. And you're looking at it, and the camera pans all the way up and all the way down. And you can see the entire state of Florida below to give you some idea of the scale of this thing. And within it are moving all these other lights moving all around it. So you go, what the heck is that thing? Is it a giant carcass, or is it just a meteorological thing, or is it some kind of organic thing? And so there's no end to the scale.
You just made me think of something completely different when we're talking about giant organisms. And then a few years ago, I read about fungus. And there are some types of fungus that live underground, under trees, and these are gigantic living organisms. And what's interesting to me about that is then this discussion of what is intelligence. And I know that you've talked a lot about this. So because we have a way that we think of intelligence, perhaps there's another way to think of intelligence.
Well, that's a good question. That's another great question. And we think of intelligence as human intelligence. But if we define intelligence, to me, one of the greatest indications is the ability to survive and procreate. And if you look at invertebrates, and like you mentioned, fungus, they adapt, they survive, they procreate in ways that we can't even imagine. Let's go back to jellyfish room. And I was reading, I just learned recently, there was a scientist named Dorothy Spangenberg who studied jellyfish and their orientation. They have little cells, they have little organisms within the disc of the jellyfish that are called statocysts. And inside each statocyst is a statolith. It's like a mineral accretion. And she wanted to find out whether they would orient the same way if they were in a zero gravity environment. So she sent jellyfish up into space on one of the space shuttle missions. And she found out that they do orient in space. They use the Earth's gravitational field to orient, and they don't orient quite the same way because there's no gravity, but they do orient. And she has in her laboratory some immature jellyfish that a British scientist had given her that predated World War II, and they were still alive. They had been living in this kind of, static, immature state. And she said they would stay that way indefinitely until they were triggered by iodine to mature to the Medusa form. But you think of an organism that just hangs out in that. So they have all these different survival instincts. Now, what their higher goal is, as humans, we always think of intelligence as an abstract thought, reaching for higher things, achieving greater things. But if these things are able to survive in all these wild conditions, all these harsh conditions, to me, that's a strong indicator of intelligence. And this is another area where I think there's a huge potential is we have learned so much. So many of our greatest technological innovations have been from nature. And so much of our exploration has been from nature, but also in partnership with other creatures. Like if you think of the exploration of the American West, a lot of that was because we learned how to work with horses. Mm-hmm. So is there a possibility if these creatures are moving across vast reaches of space that somehow we can learn from them, use some of their technology and adopt it to our own uses? I don't know.
I want to follow up on the iodine question. Did she give any indication why iodine would trigger them moving to their next level of existence?
I don't know the chemistry behind that, so I can't speak to that. But I do know that it was weird. They actually had some footage of these strange looking. It looked like something out of an Outer Limits. These strange little creatures going blah, 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 blah. And they've been hanging out there for almost 100 years. So it's strange stuff.
Well, I would be remiss to not follow up on the Marfa thing. So Scott and I worked together on a show for the Travel Channel, which was called America Declassified. And the premise of that episode, I think the producers of the show found your work. And so they wanted to do a show in Marfa. Marfa is far west Texas. I believe it is the highest elevation level in the state of Texas. And Marfa is a really interesting town. And when you get there, it's extremely arid. There's a circle of mountains. Many people have heard of the Marfa Lights. The Marfa Lights go back hundreds of years. The Native Americans used to see them. Typically, when you see these things called earth lights or spook lights, there's various legends that will go along with it, like it's the train conductor's light or whatever, some kind of a legend that's associated regionally with it. But in this episode, we went there. I was going there as the UFO host kind of guy. We were testing Scott's idea about these being bioluminescent animals. Tell us a little bit about what you thought about the Marfa experience.
Well, it's interesting, Michael, because that was my first visit to Marfa was actually what put me on this path. I've always been interested in strange phenomena. And I was traveling from Texas to California, and I said, well, I'm going to make a side trip and see the Marfa Lights. And it's like many of the places where people see these mystery lights, they are an accepted fact by the residents who live there. It's not considered weird. It's just part of their environment. And so when you drive into Marfa, they actually have a Marfa Lights viewing station. So it's like, oh, this is pretty legitimate. The Texas Department of Highways has put up a place for people to park and look at the lights. So I parked there and met a couple people, and they were skeptical, as I was a little bit. And then the lights started to come out, and we were all like, whoa, this is something else entirely. So when I watched, I saw the lights, and they were browsing around through the desert vegetation. They were pulsing and browsing around through the desert vegetation. Their intensity was getting to dim and then flare and dim and then flare. And then one of them got really, really bright, and it went up into the sky, and then it split into two. And both of them independently went down and started browsing around. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's got to be some kind of living thing. I said, that's asexual reproduction right there. It split, that thing split in two, and both pieces started moving around. Then I started thinking, if these things are using light, if they're generating light and they're browsing around in the vegetation, well, what are they doing? Like you said, it's a pretty arid environment. So any kind of desert flower would be attracted moths or insects. You know how moths are attracted to light? They may be using their light to attract prey, where they can sting the moths and actually absorb them. So Marfa is in a basin. It's in a huge volcanic basin. And if you think of the Rocky Mountains as like the Great Barrier Reef of the atmospheric ocean, anything that comes over those mountains would drain down into the basin at the base of the Rocky Mountains, which is the big, I forget the name of the caldera right now, but there are a lot of old volcanoes there. And there's also a huge underground aquifer. So although it's a desert on top, there's a lot of water underground. And there are places where, did you go to the one little spring that they had there?
No, I don't think
it's so weird. It's like something out of King Kong. You drive off into the desert, you go through these little passageways in this canyon, and then all of a sudden there's a spring with plants all around. And when we went there, I said, well, this could be a place where these things are entering the underground aquifer and then coming out. And we went there, and I said, I wonder if there's any evidence of predation. And there was a carcass right there. So that's almost like the prop department put.
You know what? I forgot about that. I was there with you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a while. So yeah, it convince a few things. No, you're right. I do remember that. And I do remember the carcass as well. Yes.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting because there was the big tough West Texas rancher that was there.
Yes.
He was listening to me a little bit skeptically, but then he told us, and I don't know if you remember this, he said there are places there he won't go because it's things that he saw, that he experienced, things moving across the desert towards some of the bodies of water there. And he also described how they have big game hunting on their ranch.
Antelope.
And they had brought a herd of antelope there. And he said they just disappeared one by one. I said, well, was there any evidence of any kind of carcasses, any kind of pelts or anything? He said, nope. And he said, your idea of something just coming down and picking them up and carrying them away. He said, that makes more sense than anything else I can think of. So,
I remember that. And he also told us that one season, I think they lost hundreds of antelope. Because I remember the conversation. It was super creepy. I'm from Texas. I'm used to that kind of terrain and the animals that live there. It was very weird to me that all of a sudden all of these antelope would be gone. But let me follow up on something else about Marfa. So while we were there, the production company that was doing the show somehow got a hold of a FLIR truck, which is forward-looking infrared. And we were able to take that truck out. So we were there, I think, shooting, I don't know, for several days. One night, the first night, I don't think that we got anything. The second night, we did see some of the lights with regular cameras. I believe you see that in the episode. And I think the third night, we were using the forward-looking infrared, and we did actually get several balls of light that I think were invisible to the naked eye, but visible on the forward-looking infrared. Now, we saw like boar, wild pigs, and cattle on the camera, but we also saw these balls of light. It was very strange.
yeah, it was very strange. And it was interesting. The operators of the FLIR, it was great having that there because it was top of high tech to be able
Yes,
to,
it was.
you could see miles across the desert.
Yes.
And it was actually the other way around. We could see the lights on the visible light camera, but there was no signature on the FLIR.
Okay.
The guys that were operating it were former military guys, and they were like, oh, we were skeptical, but they said, we never seen anything.
Yeah,
So-
because they had been on previous shows for like Bigfoot or whatever.
Yeah.
And yeah, they were actually shocked by what happened. I mean, that was an incredible experience. And I think the show's still out there, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to watch it. There's a couple of things I didn't like, and I've worked on a lot of reality television. Within reality television, you have to frame it a certain way. And I struggled with that at the time because I saw things differently than we had to portray it sometimes. And I think that your idea is far more elegant than we were able to express within a 20-minute segment on a television show. But the evidence that we got was still compelling and really interesting. And just so people know, there's some other ideas about the Marfa light. Some people say, oh, it's just a refraction of car lights coming through the hills. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen sometimes. I think they call it Fata Morgana is the light. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I'm sure that does happen sometimes, and people do see that because light bends through. And the other thing is, and I believe this gentleman's name was Charles Bunnell. He's written several books, an esteemed scientific authority on the Marfa lights. He believes that plasma is coming up out of the ground, the fourth state of matter. I believe there's granite under Marfa, and it's highly piezoelectric. And when this plasma reaches the atmosphere, it then ignites. So there's several different ideas going on with what may be happening in Marfa, which brings me to one of your statements about UFOs in general. And I'm 100% with you, which is at the end of the day, I'm kind of an all of the above guy. Like,
That's
sure, there's misinterpreted aircraft, there's aerial phenomena. There could be alien craft. There could be our craft. There could be jellyfish. Man, I'm not ruling anything out. I think all of these things could be happening. So I'm not a purist on any of this.
But I think that's a great attitude, and I want people to know that I am the biggest skeptic. And whenever I'm looking at something, I go, what could be the possible explanation for this? Like you mentioned, all of the above. It could be misinterpretation of aircraft, car lights. But when you get down to it, there is a kernel of truly unexplained lights and other objects that are moving through the atmosphere. And one of the reasons this is important is because if you think of, I think the space shuttle Columbia, before it broke up and disintegrated as it was upon reentry, one of their last missions was studying sprites. And they found that sprites were much more numerous and much more common than we had expected. So we really have no idea how many of these objects are in the atmosphere. Now, I mentioned before the analog with our microbiota forming our environment inside of us. If these things are in the atmosphere, if they are living creatures, there could be a biological component to our atmosphere. And these creatures, their activity may actually renew and create the atmosphere on which we depend for life. So it concerns me when I see some of the geoengineering attempts that are going on, like, oh, let's spray some stuff into the atmosphere or let's direct some energy up there. I think, well, we shouldn't be messing with this stuff until we understand exactly what's going on. Now, some of it, if you really want to stretch the possibilities, some of it may be intentional. The fact that we don't hear that much about this hypothesis may mean that it's very credible and people don't want us to know about it. But that's more conspiratorial. But if there is some attempts to maybe try and mitigate, these things do appear. And this is another parallel with marine invertebrates. A lot of UFOs sometimes appear in what they call flaps or armadas, or large numbers of them appear at once, as if there's a bloom of jellyfish. And if these things do appear in large numbers, there might be a danger to surface creatures. We talked about the predation of the antelope, and for some really terrifying stories, you can read about cattle mutilation, which is an ongoing long-term problem. And this might be a case of where when certain populations of these creatures explode, they are coming down for prey. But it's interesting. Some people who have studied cattle mutilations, I've shared the idea with, and I thought that they would be open to the idea, but there's been some real pushback. So
the cattle mutilation thing is well, all of these little subsets of the UFO UAP scenario, people can become very protective of their particular interest in it. People are protective of their particular belief. One thing I wanted to express to you, though, in the past week, when I was thinking about our show and I was thinking about our previous conversations and our experience in Marfa, which was an absolute blast, by the way. Scott is an incredibly funny man. I laughed my ass off in Marfa. That was a really good time. But one of the things I was thinking about is that even if you're not right about them existing here, I would think this is an incredibly plausible idea for life on other planets and other star systems, only to hear within one of your other interviews in the last day or two that I believe that you said, and I felt kind of verified by this, validated, but it was an original thought, is that Carl Sagan and Arthur C. Clarke had also posited that if you live on a gas giant or something, that these types of creatures would probably exist there.
That's right. And I think your description of feeling validated is very apt, because these guys thought ahead of time that there could be giant jellyfish moving through Jupiter or on the moon Europa, on the liquid, the giant oceans that are there. So your idea of panspermia, that's the idea that there's life everywhere.
Yeah.
And to me, as I mentioned, I think, there's not hard edges. We as humans like to have definite edges to things, but there's not a hard line between the surface of the ocean and the atmosphere. And there's not a hard line between the edge of the atmosphere and space. They found out that our atmosphere extends beyond the moon. So we saw the comet in our lifetime. We saw the comet Shoemaker-Levy smash into Jupiter. They said
9 different pieces, I believe, it hit Jupiter, I think.
Pieces of the comet hit Jupiter. And they said it hit with more than the force of all the atom bombs on Earth. And it actually ejected material into space. And you can actually see there's photographs of this thing hitting Jupiter and stuff being thrown out into space. So if there are creatures like jellyfish on Jupiter, and if they have forms that are somewhat indestructible, if they get ejected into space, might they travel through our atmosphere? Through space into our atmosphere, where they might blossom into something like sprites. Who knows? I think we have to realize our limitations, which are, we have our 2 little eyes in front of our blob of fat, which is our brain, and the limits of our conceptualization. And this is another challenge that I think we're facing. And you mentioned about people being a little bit territorial and protective of their theories, their hypotheses. The idea of UFOs, there's no such thing as a UFO expert, because if there was an expert, then why are they still unidentified? And I think people They like the idea because as long as they remain as long as they remain unidentified, they're kind of like a Rorschach blot. You can impose your own ideas on them.
Yes.
But I'm saying we have to put a stake in the ground and say, okay, we got to start studying these things and we got to start looking at them as the possibility of something else. We got to say, yeah, we have names for, and this is one of the challenges too. We have names for different creatures. We have like the bugs, fish, birds. So what do we call these things? And I think this is one of the things I wanted to talk with you about today and ask is, I've convinced myself this is worthy of further study, but it's kind of frustrating because it's like I see people chasing around in circles and I go, if we just apply these observation and some of the technology we already have, we're going to see more of these things. And that is what we did with the Cohoke light in West Point, Virginia. If these things are living creatures, we should be able to observe them in their habitat over the course of time. So for almost a year, I did repeated field observations in West Point, Virginia, where people had reported seeing what they call the Cohoke light. And I didn't even know about this. My daughter was going to school at William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And I told them about mystery lights. And they said, oh, have you heard about the Cohoke light? And I was like, no. So I actually spent a year going there repeatedly. I met with the Pamunkey Indian tribe that was there. I met with local residents that were there, and they all told me their stories about the light. And we actually, in my limited resources and this limited field study, we recorded objects, flying, glowing objects that nobody's ever recorded before. And so with that limited experience, that limited field study, it's proof of concept that if we just do this at multiple locations, we're going to find more of these things. But the challenge is how to get a good look at them, because we're always reacting after the fact. Something goes flying by and you go, oh, what was? So that's one of the big challenges.
I just thought of something amongst a few things. I mean, we could go on for days with this show. One thing that I was talking to recently with a person who kind of a UFO guy, but really covers a lot of topics. And one of the things that we find very interesting in UFOs, because people always say, for God's sakes, everybody's got an iPhone. So why does nobody get a good picture of a UFO? Well, one effect that UFOs, UAPs seem to have on people, and I would say this is another comparison to your theory or hypothesis, is that they are able to exert influence over our consciousness. And so a lot of people that see UFOs, they're just kind of like dumbfounded and unable to really react in a timely manner, because everybody's like, well, if I saw a UFO, the first thing I'm going to do is going to get my camera out and I'm going to shoot a bunch of footage. Oh, that's great. That's great in theory. But in many cases, there have been people, they were like, I couldn't do anything, or I was just kind of frozen, dumbfounded in awe or hypnotism or something, which makes me think of these neurotoxins or these gases that your creatures might be putting out.
My creatures.
Our creatures.
My gelatinous brethren.
Our creatures, our invertebrates.
I got a funny story, which actually, a lot of it is, I think you're right. They might be befuddled or enchanted or whatever.
Yeah.
I think Jenny Randall's the UFO reacher.
Yes.
She calls it the Oz effect. That time seems to slow down and everything.
Yes.
I was down at West Point, Virginia, and the light is seen mainly along this railroad track.
Yes.
And there's trees on either side of the track. And we had like 5 cameras pointing down the track. And over the top of one set of trees, this light from up in the sky came and shone this blast of green light, just went poof. Actually, I'm sorry. It started in the trees. A blast of green light went from the trees, went poof up into the sky. And then almost immediately afterwards, this 10 times bigger blast of light from the sky, like an answer to the light from the trees, went and shone down. And then the light from the tree went back up again. And everybody's standing there going, and I said, did anybody get that? He had 5 cameras pointing down there. And everybody's like, no, we didn't. Nobody got. So and these things happen fast. So if you think like nature's quick, how many photographs are there of a hawk catching a bird? Or these things happen very quickly. So it's hard to react and get your focus right and everything. I think that's one of the challenges, is that our time scale is not necessarily nature's time scale.
And at least with a hawk or wildlife that we're familiar with, you can go out in the Serengeti or the top of a mountain or wherever it is that you typically see these things, and at least you can kind of lie in wait. I think the challenge that you have and researchers going forward is this is such an unknown area of study that it's far more unpredictable even than just shooting regular wildlife.
It is. I've actually identified a lot of different places around on the surface of the planet where people regularly see these mystery lights. And I think that's a great place to start. I think if we really, really want to explore this hypothesis and test it, a lot of the NASA footage was found where night meets day. We call it the terminator. It's the line, and it's constantly moving around the planet, that interface between night and day. And if you think of the habitat edges, that is one of the greatest habitat edges, and it's moving all the time. There was repeated incidents where the astronauts recorded as they're moving from night into day, as they hit day, there's like this huge migration of objects into the energy of the oncoming sun. And you can imagine the direct sun might be a little too intense for these creatures, but that interface between night and day at the terminator, that's where there's just some absolutely amazing footage. So I'd like to propose to one of the space companies that we send up some kind of probe to actually explore the terminator like we would send up a submersible into the oceans, because I think that is one of the best target environments to try and find these things.
That is fascinating. I would support that.
So I got to ask you for your advice.
Yes.
I've tried to promote this thing. I've spent years of my life trying to promote this thing. I think it's important. I think there's huge potential. One of the ideas is, okay, we're at an interesting point in human history right now.
Yes.
And we have worldwide instant communication, people from all over the world aware of people from all over the world. What are we going to do? And I'm kind of the camp. A gentleman named Guy Murchie wrote a book called The 7 Mysteries of Life. And one of his mysteries of life is what he called the germination of worlds. And he thought that it's time for the world to blossom and send things out. And I think that's one possibility. There's kind of an instinctive feeling that UFOs mean something. There's something important about them. These things might be a pathway for us to explore the idea of injecting ourselves into panspermia, putting ourselves out into the universe and taking what we have here and putting it into a much greater distribution of our human intelligence. So I think that's one important reason to study it. But I wanted to ask you, how do we overcome this challenge? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I have a thought,
Yeah.
and I'm glad you put it this way. So ever since I met you in 2013, because I had not, even though I've been a follower of the UFO subject since I was a kid, I had never heard this particular idea. Around that same time, I began, maybe this is the phenomena where all of a sudden you buy a certain type of car and then you see that car everywhere. What I have noticed since meeting you is the proliferation of interest in squids and jellyfish. Just go into like a home decor store and you'll see all kinds of like bibs or you'll see squids and jellyfish in many places. People sell jellyfish as decorative items. Do you know the film Arrival?
Oh, yes. That's right. The squid-like creatures. Yes.
So my point is that it's in the zeitgeist. I believe that this is in the zeitgeist. And I do think that there's something whispering in our ear about other forms of intelligence. And when I was at Contact a couple of weeks ago, I enjoyed it. I went with some friends. But one of the big subjects of Contact was consciousness. And much of the UFO community wants there to be this kind of nuts and bolts hardware aspect of this. Hey, I do too, man. Show me a craft. But there is this evolution into realizing that our consciousness may be the actual gateway into whatever it is that is out there and beginning to know more about it. And if we're talking about consciousness, it may also extend to creatures or organisms that don't think the way we do, and they may inhabit our planet. And we're only now beginning to see the significance of that.
I think, yeah, those are all great points. There's a lot of evidence in the past that humans interacted with these creatures. If you look, one of the most prevalent artifacts on almost every continent are pyramids.
Mm-hmm.
They take a lot of energy to build, and you think, well, why were these people building pyramids? And I think it was to reach something up in the sky, to provide these things with some kind of way to interact with them.
Yes.
In fact, it's interesting. I don't know if I ever told you this story. There's a place called Cohoke in Illinois.
I've never been there. Keep going.
Well, there's a pyramid there called the Monk's Mound. It's like an earthen pyramid, and it's the largest pyramid in the Americas. And my wife and I went there, and it was near sunset, and we were on top of the mound. And off in the distance, we saw this isolated storm. It was like a well-defined storm cloud, and it started moving right towards us. It was like coming towards us from miles away. And I said, that thing looks like it's coming right towards us. I think we better get. But you realize that there are many pyramids, and people described what they were encountering as gods, offering up to the gods or some kind of creatures. And maybe that's sort of a signpost for us. Maybe we should be reaching up to these things. Now, one cautionary note is that those civilizations that had all those pyramids, where are they? The people are gone. So, maybe there's a change or some kind of, maybe they all just collapsed under their own weight, or maybe they were taken away somewhere else. I don't know.
Cahokia, I believe, at one point was the most populated center north of Mexico City.
It's unbelievable. The history of our own Midwest, all the mounds and the Serpent Mound, the Mound Builders Monument. There's a huge ancient history. Like you said, at one point, I think that the Hopewell culture, they call it, there was more population then than there is now. Yeah, in the Ohio River Valley down there. So it's amazing. But like that was a personal encounter, and it was a little disturbing because we both felt without saying anything, and that thing was coming right towards us as we were on top of the pyramid.
I tell you what, we're going to get ready to wrap this thing up. Scott, I could talk to you forever, and we've already gone longer than I typically do. On a completely different note, you're a filmmaker, and you have a fiction film out right now. So feel free to tell people about that and how they can watch it and what it is.
Well, thank you, Michael. I produce comic books and I produce films. I love telling stories. I think stories are one of the great ways to teach people, and they create a bond amongst people, and they give us lessons for our own lives and for our culture. So I created this movie called Dracula. It's Dracula with a W on the end. You can see that posted back there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a horror comedy. It's about a lawyer who uses the law to steal people's time. Instead of sucking blood, he uses the law to steal people's time. And it's kind of a horror movie that you can watch with your kids or your parents because it's creepy and it's disturbing, but it's also funny. I researched a lot about old European myths about the range of vampires. And so there's some of those myths in there. There was a creepy creature called the Whisperer that would sit on people's shoulder and whisper doubt into their ear so that they didn't do what they were going to do. It gave them doubt and self-doubt and, lack of confidence. But that's a really creepy creature. So we have a creature like the Whisperer in there. And we ended up shooting the trailer. It was an old vampire scene. And it was like traditional, like guy popping out of the ground sort of thing. Yeah. And it went so well. I said, heck, let's just make the whole movie. So 7 years later, and it's now available on all streaming services. It's on Amazon Prime. It's on Apple TV. It's on Google Play. It's on YouTube TV. I hope you enjoy it. It's got a great soundtrack. The actors were great. It's got a lot of fun visual effects and some really wild sequences in it. And maybe a little bit of social satire. The bad guy's a lawyer, but the good guy's a lawyer too. So it's all about returning to the basis, the essence of law, and not the abuse of it.
Well, I know you mentioned the soundtrack. I know you have a good taste in music. So ladies and gentlemen, check that out. And Scott, tell everybody about your websites and any place that people can see your work.
You can check out the whole idea, the Sky is Alive article that Michael mentioned. That's I tried to distill the essence of the hypothesis. It's at thelivingsky.com, or you can check out glowfilm.com. That's my production company. There's also a YouTube channel, The Living Sky, and we have lots of little vignettes about different things. It's an endlessly rich topic. Yes. There are so many different topics that I would love to explore, but we're always limited by time. But right now, I'm actually going to be visiting Hessdal in Norway for their field trip at the end of August and the beginning of September.
They have lights there.
They have lights there. And again, the people there just take it for granted as part of their culture. But those folks are an inspiration. They've been doing it for like 50 years. They have an observation. They're constantly upgrading their technology. And so what I hope to do is learn from them and maybe perhaps get a framework that maybe we can apply to other sites around the world. And this is, if you don't mind, one more question I have for you is, how do we proceed? I'm at the point now where I think maybe we should be promoting a whole new science of aerobiology. So I'm curious if you have any advice as to how we can push that.
Well, I thought that was already a science. Is it not?
Well, it's kind of a weak science at this point. It's a study of like airborne mold and bacteria in terms of how they
related to diseases, probably
crops and human. Yeah. And it started out, the whole science of it started out as studying how infections spread in hospital by the airflow through the hospitals. And now it's actually how do spores and fungus spread over crops and how do some bugs spread, but they're not looking at kind of macroorganisms. In fact, I actually checked, there's not even that I can find, there's not a master's program anywhere in aerobiology. I think this is something I would encourage young people to really look at the frontiers of science and to study marine biology, but also we got to start opening up this whole realm for study and observing what's above us, because it's going to have a huge effect on our current lives and on our future. So,
Scott, I think sometimes it takes a lot of courage to think outside the box and pursue truth when a lot of other people are scared to do it. And that's the situation that you find yourself in. I think it's like you have an idea. And I remember, and I hope I'm getting this gentleman's name, Charles Bunnell, that we spoke with in Marfa. I remember him saying, he goes, I don't necessarily think that you're right, but that is an incredibly elegant idea and I love it. And
wow,
that always stuck with me because it's like, it is an elegant idea. And right now you are the one guy who probably is espousing this the loudest, but all you got to do is look at pop culture. And it was a hit movie 2 years ago. So
I actually have my own script about the whole topic, and it's interesting. Actually, I had never heard that about James Bunnell, and that's great to hear. I love hearing that.
No, we were on a conference call, but it was before we even did the show. I remember, I took the call at work, and I was working on a reality show for somebody else that I won't mention. But I remember you and I and he and Seth, one of the producers, were all on this call, and at the end of it, he said that, and it always stuck with me because I was like, "That's very well said. It is an elegant idea. Unfortunately, you may be the solitary disciple or apostle of this idea at the moment, but it clearly is catching hold because, like I say, people have made movies about the exact idea. So sometimes it just takes a moment."
There was a gentleman who was a former NASA engineer named William Corliss, and he was kind of like a modern day Charles Fort. He cataloged things that we don't know.
Yeah.
And he had these massive books of, weird luminous phenomena, weird animals, weird geological, great stuff. And I corresponded with him and he said, you're going to need a body. So and it's interesting. I have a clip of Bunnell and he talks about, he said he was out there with a kid and his father. And he said, one of these Marfa lights came down and landed on his hand.
That's right.
And
Yes.
like the big blob that the Philadelphia policeman saw, he said it just vaporized right in front of him, right in front of his hand. So that's your body right there. And that was one of the reasons that we have glass jellyfish from the 1800s, is because you can't preserve a jellyfish. They're going to just dissolve. So we've looked at the idea of perhaps spraying DNA, deploying DNA, some kind of luminol to see if what we're seeing is actually, wouldn't it be cool to spray luminol on top of a Sprite and see if it glows, and if you don't get eaten instead. But
well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. My name is Michael Parker. If you like these types of conversations and you like having your mind blown occasionally, well, then you're in the right place. Please help a brother out. Give me a like, give us a subscription, and go check out Scott's work at The Living Sky. And until next time, keep your heart and your mind open. Peace.